One person's trash is another's treasure, they have said since at least 1860. Here are some examples of that. In 1904, a man named James Bonner, in Hampstead, England, was looking through some of his old possessions with a friend. His companion glanced through a collection of stamps that Bonner had collected as a schoolboy around 1864. Suddenly he exclaimed, "Here's a post office Mauritius. It's worth a fortune." Bonner decided to obtain an expert opinion if the tiny piece of paper really was worth a fortune. At once he was offered £1,000 to part with the unused twopenny blue stamp, the equivalent of £124,000 in 2021. However, he decided that he would sell it at auction instead. The stamp was so prized due to its rarity. The original engraving in 1847 had the words Post Office. The plates were redone in 1848 for the next printing, and the words Post Paid substituted. As only 500 of each stamp bore the original words, those which survived became very collectible. In 1904 it was thought that only 4 or 5 unused copies existed. Bonner could not remember where he got the stamp from, but thought it was probably in a swap with another boy or in a group of stamps he bought for 1 or 2 pennies from a school friend. When the auction took place, the opening bid was £500, vindicating his choice. Eventually, the long-ignored stamp sold to a Mr. Crawford for the record price of £1,450. Crawford was buying it on behalf of someone else, rumoured to be the Prince of Wales, a keen philatelist. The stamp is now valued at £2 million. A charwoman died a pauper in Amsterdam in 1937. Among her few possessions sold off by her relatives was a collage of a trotting horse created from stamps. The woman had been given the picture by a clergyman in 1912. Her relatives sold it for 3 pence. A butcher bought it for 3 shillings, and believing some of the stamps to be valuable, sold it to a dealer for £900. One of the stamps was a Mauritius Post Office orange red, which was then valued at £5,500. In 1947, another 1847 Mauritius Post Office stamp made a surprise and welcome appearance. This time it was another one of the less rare 1-penny orange-red stamps. There were 12 of them known to exist. Mr. R. Haydock, a Perth stamp dealer, found it amongst a pile of old stamps he was sorting. At first he didn't realise what he had, but on looking again he identified the stamp. The Standard Gibbons Stamp Catalogue listed the value of the stamp then as £4,350. Mr. Haydock had the stamp placed in a bank for safety. An old blue and white vase had stood for some years on a lady's sideboard in England. When she passed away in 1974, it was among some items inherited by her 3 children. Her eldest son, acting as executor, took the ceramic pieces, lacquers and embroidery, wrapped in a pullover to an auctioneer's to be valued, hoping that maybe he could sell the lot for £100. The vase, which he thought his grandfather may have acquired in the early years of the 20th century, was sold at auction to a dealer for £135,000. It was a 15th century Ming vase in almost perfect condition. In 1925, J.B. Lee, the Brisbane agent of a Sydney radio firm, went to an auction of artworks from an estate in Sydney. There was a painting of an old club which had once existed in Bligh Street, which he wished to purchase. He had to buy the painting he wanted in a batch of 6, which cost him £4. Among the paintings was one of the Madonna with a penetrating stare, which so annoyed his wife that Mr. Lee took it down from his wall where he had hung it and placed it in a back room. 2 years after he purchased it, he sent the painting to a dealer to be retouched. It was then that he learned his painting was by the 13th century Florentine master, Giotto. His cheap acquisition was worth at least £30,000. He insured the painting for £20,000 and was planning to sell it, hoping to raise £50,000. At Lille, France in 1930, a painting that had lain in an attic for 50 years unloved, and another dumped in another attic in Surrey, England, dirty with the canvas torn, had something in common with a painting at an English auction in 1936, which drew little interest and which sold for £3. They were all by the same artist, a man whose works weren't in favour with collectors during the 19th century, which explains why so many were left neglected in attics for decades. His name was Frans Hals, a 17th century Dutch master, considered second only to Rembrandt as a painter. A Hulls portrait sold in 1999 for almost $13 million. The painting in Surrey had been bequeathed by a great-aunt to Mrs. Pamela Parker, and considered worthless. She hadn't even bothered to move it when some rain came through the roof and trickled onto the work. It sold in 1937 for £12,705. One of the strangest windfalls of all time was actually a fall. A Mrs. Anna Briggs of Sacramento, California, was in her backyard in 1939 when something small and solid hit her head, knocking her to her knees. She recovered to find that she had been hit by a ring. It was discovered that the ring had fallen from a commercial plane flying overhead. It was lost by a retired Chicago physician, Dr. W. Stanley. He identified his property and rewarded Mrs. Briggs with £80 and a trip to the New York World's Fair. German consular authorities read the story and took notice of Mrs. Briggs' backstory and got in contact with her. She was identified as the sole heir to the estate of her paternal uncle, Andreas Suber, who had died in Grosselbeck, Germany, leaving an estate worth £25,000. Sometimes it is not the object itself which is the fortune. In Paris in 1924, a dealer in second-hand goods sold a dirty old stove to a man for 10 francs. As the stove was being moved onto a handcart, a plate dislodged from the side, and out flowed some dirty old grease, and with it a hoard of gold coins. An argument between the pair finished at a police station, where the dealer was forced to accept that the stove was no longer his property, and nor were the 50,000 francs which had been hidden within it. Who knows how many old stamps, paintings, bits of china and other bric-a-brac that have been thrown away as worthless junk might actually have been worth a lot.